Hello and welcome to part 3. I'm sorry, I think I said part 4 at the end of part 2. I'm sorry. Just call me bad at maths. On occasion. And so we are starting off with Karl Donitz's the recorded video, which was 51 minutes long. Hopefully this part won't be 51 minutes long. Right then. Stephen Cross, he got off easy because the folks then could point at the Allied submarine campaigns, and especially the US one against Japan, and go, hello, pop me kettle. Probably a very political decision. Calvin Gasberg. Yes, someone perhaps intentionally was stupid enough to cite the Laconia incident against Donitz, which produced a textbook legal backfire. Stephen Cross, Calvin Gasberg. I'd not be surprised that with the stuff they know now, his sentence would have been different. If they had stuff we know about now about Spear, he'd have a shortfall with a sudden stop in it, no doubt. Stephen Cross. Also, he should have stood for something. The only issue there is if he had gone, guys, maybe, stop gassing the Jews and slaughtering the Poles and stuff, then the lead content in his body would have risen remarkably far shortly afterwards. Probably along with any few family members. Nazi regime is not one where you could go, now stop on steady on chaps and now suffer consequences, and not suffer the consequences, especially in such a high-profile role. If he had spoken out and tried to stand for something other than probably the worst regime in history, he'd either been dismissed or shot. Damned if you don't, damned if you do. Ben Wilson. He was guilty of many crimes. He was a Nazi, he believed. Some of his specific crimes were well known. The use of slave labour and forced labour. He issued orders not to pick up or assist any Allied sailors. He was in command of forces that carried out summary execution of captured naval personnel against the Geneva Convention. All those are true. And yet he got off. And honestly, I sometimes wonder if the reason he got off is because he wasn't Hitler. He got off because, frankly, Hitler had killed himself and this was the second head of state, and they were worried going too hard after a head of state would set a precedent for future. '99 Einjik. He got off easy, maybe, but what did he do that the US submarine commander did not? All sides of Model 2 did very nasty things. From British and US firebombing of German and Japanese cities to the US dropping nukes on Japan. Sure, the Axis started the war, but using crappy British anti-gun laws as an example is not an argument. Did the USSR get done for war crimes, like shooting all those Polish officers at Courten, or their mass sexual assaults of German women from the 7 to 70 in 1945? I wouldn't say crappy British anti-gun laws. I'm quite keen on those anti-gun laws. I'm sorry if you're not, but they seem to work fine for me. They seem to, as a whole, deter too much gun crime. They limit it. Mainly because, let's be honest, in the UK, your options if you start carrying guns as a criminal are SO19 comes along, or if you go too much higher firepower, the SAS comes along. Either way, it's not a good life. It's not a good enough. Well, considering your general level of firepower you're going to have to deal with on the other side, it's kind of an overmatch and causes issues. My response, the USR is a whole other issue, and as much as I wish we would have held them to the standards we were setting, that would have been a whole other war. No one wanted that at the time. Myself, I found it troubling they managed to scrape on the charges against humanity. My view is that if he didn't know what was going on, he obviously should never be in charge of a navy, as he knows sense and obviously doesn't listen to Canaris. And that if he did know what was going on, then he's as culpable as the rest. 99 Andrew. Clarke. I love your channel, but I find the whole idea of victors' war crimes trials very dodgy. I believe in Winston Churchill said something like, "It is a good thing we are on the winning side." The British and American alliance versus USSR made the whole thing largely a mockery, in my view, and I detest Nazis as much as I detest Stalin's communism. Response. As I said, I can see your point, but my view is that we've always had the scenario there are some criminals that, for whatever reason, usually extradition treaties, we can't touch. That doesn't mean you don't prosecute the ones you have. Again, on the Allied front, you are right, but as said, for me, the submarine war, as much as you cannot like it, We all did it to a great certain extent. Then genocide? No, that was German. That was, I agree, especially in regard to the Poland and leaderships of various Eastern European states, Soviet. The states for allies, yes, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't prosecute the ones you have. Come goes back. Regarding Nuremberg, I think not many people got sentenced unjustly, but many more were not on trial. As for the Soviets, well, the urban legend of Churchill saying, "we slaughtering the wrong pig," is true, even if he did not say this. I doubt he did that. He said it. Anyway, Steamwish. Political ineptitude does not equate to the military kind. Yeah, their civil government was an insane cluster, a surreal Mongol feudalism. But the thing about totalitarian systems is that they hide all the faults very well. Not just hide them from view, but keep them from becoming critical as well. Forget to order enough doodads, steal all the doodads from France, and make this manufacturing company there stop everything and start making more doodads. Running low on grain in Bavaria, take it away from Serbians. It's good to be the king, because the king's ineptitude can be masked and not compensated for easily. Brute strength works as well as cunning and nuance, just not as efficiently. A tank's engine is not efficient after all. No, it really isn't. And that's not really a good system for an economy. As for the military reality, don't forget that the best the British had put up against them on land often failed. Really? And in the early war years, more often than not. I would say in Norway it's more a political decision to withdraw and go and concentrate in France. And I would say in France, the French are running it, and they don't think the Germans will get through the Ardennes forest, and their preparations in the Ardennes forest aren't really set up right. So, as much as I can, that you can, to an extent, say the British are partially culpable for that, to an extent, I wouldn't really say that's a running victory of it. Greece, that was fought with whatever could be grabbed from North Africa. So we're already supposed to be fighting the Italians down there, sent across the sea to Greece. Then in Crete is just a massive thing. It's not really, I would consider, the German troops against the German troops. I would say it's to an extent German luck against British luck and the British strategic issues. The Low Countries, France and Norway and Greece prove that. They are not just a dig, and not a dig, they're just a reality check. They were epic fails. It is a dig, Steve, let's be honest. And France, again, you're blaming it all on the British. I'm sorry, is it Britain's role to protect France? No. The British were supposed to be supporting and slotting into France and going up into Belgium with them. And that's what the British provided and the British were capable of doing. And they did that quite well. And they did fight a few battles against the Germans, and they managed to do quite well those, and then they did a fighting retreat to go withdraw. And they withdrew fairly well. That's quite good. It's not what you'd want to do, but it's not really something I'd like the British. Norway, again, that's the politicians, not the army. So that's the political system. That you're right, it's a fail, but it's not a fail of German troops versus British troops. And you keep putting us as the best the British put up against them. The best the British put up. It's not the troops that are failing here. And Greece, again, well, in the nicest way, Crete, as I pointed out, was the Italians. Actually did a fairly good job saving the Germans in that one, because the Germans, despite the British issues and various issues in holding place in Crete, they were still not winning. Or rather, not winning fast enough. The RN cannot win the war alone. I don't think I've ever said they could. Although there are certainly some tribal class captains who possibly thought they should give it a go. No matter how good they were, or even if they sank every German destroyer ever made. Frankly, until 1943, the Allied armies were not up to the task. Let me just check something. Yeah, I was just checking. The Battle of El Alamein takes place in 1942. There are a fair number of other battles, Steve. I'm not sure where you're reading your history, but Allied armies were not up to the task is not something I would start banding around till 1943. there is a lot of issues with the strategic leadership at the beginning of the war. There is a lot of issues with the way the army and etc. forces are employed, and I have again got into the issues in Singapore and Malaya, and there are very, very bad problems and there, and I don't hide that at all. But I think you're sort of going down the route of claiming the German army were these super soldiers and all the Allied troops were just terrible. They're not. They're fairly good troops. Sometimes they're improperly led, sometimes they're put in the wrong places, but they're fairly good troops. And they're doing quite well. So one wonders how the Germans should have been defeated earlier when everything the Allies tried to speed up failed. Market Garden being a good example of how weak the Germans were. Well, Market Garden, in the nicest way, is improperly planned, and that if you were going to really do Market Garden properly, you should also be doing an amphibious operation to go round and back it up, and you should have more sustained it. But in many ways, Market Garden is thrown into it, and they do get 2 out of 3 bridges. The thing is, they're going a bridge too far, quite literally, because getting the 3rd bridge depends on everything getting there right. And you either need to have a second corridor of armor and have enough armor to do 2 thrusts simultaneously so that you can cut off the Germans and keep pushing. You also need to get more bridge tech up that, or you need to do an amphibious assault. There are ways to fix Market Garden. They weren't, but in the nicest way, that is a long way away. That's a Monty, Eisenhower, Bradley issue going on in the late war. That's not saying that British troops were terrible till 1943. Up until spring 1945, when the Germans actually wanted the Western Allies to succeed and capture more land before the Russians got it. And if you were a line soldier, I doubt that you want the Allies to try harder to win the war and end the war quicker, if it meant throwing you into an unnecessary desperate battle. I don't think that's what I said at any point, Steve. I said during the war, there were several, towards the end, after they'd done for it, they were looking at German industry, looking at the infrastructure, looking at the decisions Germans made logistically, and wondering why they hadn't managed to push it quicker. And that's a legitimate point to make. Honestly, as we've been over, the invasion of France is a complete and utter mystery to the Germans on how it succeeds. If they had stopped to fuel, as their actual plan said, but Guderian and his panzers decide to just keep charging on, and Rommel keeps charging on, ignoring the plan set out and the planned refueling stop, which is why they run out of fuel later in the campaign, a few days later, and need to be urgently refueled. The French would have been in position, and they might well have been slowed enough to be for the forces to be moved, or various other things. If they had literally followed their plan. So, I'm sorry if my saying that the German war machine and a lot of war does actually sometimes turn on luck. But it does. And sometimes you get troops thrown into a position which strategically you should never put them into, because they can't do it, because you're not going to be able to support enough. Or sometimes you withdraw from a position where actually tactically you're doing quite well, and strategically you should probably do that because of the politics of it. And the politics of it was, well, if we win in France, then surely they'll collapse in Norway, and we have to win in France, because if they win in France, then France might be knocked out, and that's a bigger problem for us than Norway being knocked out right now. But honestly, Steve, I do take umbrage, and this is not in a patriotic way, because Yes, it can come off as patriotism, but I defend on many other times the Italians, the Germans. I say how good they are because, in the nicest way, you're made quality by the quality of the enemies you fight. So either you're saying that Germans were terrible soldiers and only won because the British were worse, or you're saying the Germans were brilliant soldiers, in which case, why didn't they wipe out and take all the British prisoner? If the British troops weren't good soldiers, then they wouldn't have been able to put up the fight they did against the Germans and done as well as they did do. So that's the point I'm making when I'm talking about this. I'm saying the forces are in many ways balanced and are good troops on both sides, good soldiers on both sides who are effective at fighting. It's not a zero-sum game. The British don't have to be terrible. The British don't have to be... Allied armies don't have to be able to... not up to the task till 1943, which is patently wrong. I'm sorry. There are several battles even preceding El Alamein, mainly in North Africa, but a few others around the world, which that's not the case. In order for Germany to win what it does win. There are other issues. And let's be honest, the biggest issue in France is the psychology of the French leadership and the fact that they get trapped into this thing of being defeated. It's not the French soldiers, it's not the French generals, although they are part of it. It's the lack of communications gear, and it's the French psychology in terms of their senior leadership and the scarring of World War One. Again, that doesn't mean the French soldiers were bad soldiers. They fought hard. They fought really hard. And they did well, holding up as long as they could when they knew they weren't going to hold it up forever. They knew they were going to have to fall back. Street Racer. Imagine a discussion of Nimitz, where you constantly bring up that he worked under Democrat politicians and how much you disagree with Democrat policy. If that sounds weird to you, then you know how this video sounds. My point to response to that Street Racer was Nimitz didn't become head of state. Eisenhower, however, but leaving that to one side, I was trying to make the point that Donitz was different. That he wasn't a convert for love of Germany or a convert for the sake of Navy. He was a true believer who got his position because of that. I talked about politics a lot because Donitz was a political creation. Nick Vaughan then responded to something quite interesting. Dr. Clarke, he even wrote a letter to his successor and candidate for president in West Germany. Matthew Griffiths. Talking about preparation, especially on the earlier videos, which navies would you say were the most prepared of the major navies, and were any of the smaller forces even more prepared for when it began? I would argue the Italian navy was pretty well prepared, although in terms of ships procured, they weren't prepared in terms of resources. I would argue the British forces, thanks to the orders they made in 1939, based on the work they did in 1938, were on their way to being prepared in terms of ships, but were in infrastructure terms prepared very well because they had fuel stores all around the world. Huge stores of fuel. The Americans were trying to get there. Small forces, not really. None of them are really prepared. No one's really prepared. They have areas where they're strong in. They're either strong in infrastructure terms or they're strong in ship terms, but no one seems to be strong in both. Matthew Griffiths, talking... I've answered that question. And Nick Ford, don't forget the unique smell of oil, grease, and diesel oil in a confined space. Yes, submarines are not nice places to be. They're stinky. Andrew Cox, of all the Kriegsmarine admirals, had the problem that they were basically given impossible tasks. Donitz is, or at least appears to be, one of those who believed it was impossible. He was also almost Russian in his need for central control and continued sending boats out even when it's clear the battle was lost. That is the reason why I personally don't rate him. He does really need to be in control. Ben Wilson, it was further proved that night was by far the most opportune time for attack because the U-boats could get within firing range much quicker and more often. Therefore, the night was used basically for concentrated attacks by U-boats, and day attacks were undertaken only in favourable conditions. The comparatively small and manoeuvrable Type V7C proved itself excellent for night attacks. The great U-boat aces of that time, such as Captain Lieutenants Plin, Kirchner, and Speck, were all 7C drivers. They swore by this type of boat, and when changing boats did not wish to take on any of the new larger ones. Never, in my opinion, have Germans in the front line been so convinced of the quality of technical material and type of their boat, type of boat as the German U-boat men in this war. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz of the Kriegsmarine. Yeah. There are many true believers at times. J. Heaven Woven. If Karl was a mediocre admiral in the British Navy, wouldn't he have been put in charge of the remaining battlecruisers? Alabiti. No, the battlecruisers were getting very good admirals by this point. It's going to be Africanus. Right. He was not evil because he was not a good admiral. It was because he was a zealous Nazi. Can you discuss in more detail Operation Drumbury and the assault on the US East Coast? This was very successful against the US. Admirals King and Andrews certainly were part of the U-boat success. Basically, he was throwing everything he had at it. He'd planned it out, had an idea of it, but honestly, it was to try and get every boat he could there. And it was the same thing he repeated throughout the war. Whenever there were areas which had less escorts, were less likely to have escorted convoys or heavy presence of aircraft, he would try and truck his boats into that area. That was his policy throughout World War II, and it was very successful. You stick them in one area, the Allies build up strength and their infrastructure in that area to secure it, then you move to another area. The Allies can't afford to remove the stuff they have in the previous area because you just come back. So they then have to build up even more in another area. It's a very successful doctrine. But it's not his doctrine. As I pointed out, it's not his idea. That's the thing. He's executing someone else's doctrine, someone else's strategy. These newts. Honestly, the biggest damnation of Donitz that despite having a longer war and more advanced U-boats, he led a worse anti-shipping campaign than the German submarine fleet did in World War I. Can certainly make that case. Jessica Lou, I'm not gonna get in that one, but it was a cool joke. Right then. And so, good lord. And the Courten. The last of the Italian ones. Well, the last of the Italian ones from World War II, not the last of the Italian admirals. Arguably my second favourite of the Italians. Right then, let's see. Karl goes, the Courten suspiciously close geographically to a certain Bugmil Notvi, who was the Austro-Hungarian torpedo boat, then destroyer commander, then after war, first commander of New Poland, and somehow moved to Italy in 1934 and died there. Maybe. Ben Awesome, thank you. A suggestion on the subject. The Kriegsmarine use of Biber midget submarine operation was carried out by senior midshipman Langsdorff, who succeeded in firing 2 torpedoes into the locks at Antwerp before putting the locks out of operation for 20 days. He did not return. Ooh, I have to look into that one. Stein Jets, hello. I like the vid and added a comment for logarithm boosting purposes. Thank you. Decision. Would they be able to send the Italian Navy to the Pacific for operations? I seem to remember that they had very short-legged ships. Some of the bigger ones is my answer to that one. And certainly with replenishment C. Decision says, thanks, I've always wondered how the viable French and Italian ships would have been for the Pacific for that reason. The point is, if you consider the expected losses that they were going to have fighting off the Japanese coast, the idea that you were going to keep any ships out of it that you had access to was unlikely. So the odds are, with rousing, etc., you would have seen them coming in. Probably the Americans would ask them to be attached to the British Task Force 58. Because the British could then, because they'd be small packets and it'd be far easier to absorb into the British structure than it would into the American structure, which is far more numerous. And the British are used to dealing with some more custom groupings. So that is where they would be put in, but I do think they would have been sent in. I do, because, again, otherwise you're running out of ships. You're running out of people. And these are people you have available to use. And frankly, if they're off in the Pacific, they're not going to cause any trouble in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. And if they try and cause any trouble in the Pacific, there is a huge, stonking, great big fleet around them. Could have changed some of the stuff after World War II quite heavily. Right then. Next one. P9. Shigetaro Shimada. Gillian Borg, stop listening to yourself and maybe you'll become more interesting. Well, my response, Guillaume, is, as ever, thank you for commenting. I'm sorry I won't be subscribing, as you said in another comment, but I hope you find someone in a wide variety of YouTube that fits your needs and interests. I hope really you do. And I'm not sure what you mean by listening to myself, but I do tend to listen to myself talk just in case I make a mistake. And then I can correct it. And I kind of worry about the concept of people who don't listen to themselves. Because then you might say stuff and not realize what you said. I might have said the wrong thing, so that would surely be not right. I basically, thank you for commenting. So, how did he avoid being hanged? My view is that he was very cooperative, and honestly, most were surprised he was the rank he was. So didn't really think him capable of organizing anything, so ergo couldn't be held culpable. But that's a working guess. Stephen Cross. I recall reading in Shadow Sword that Nagano used to either deliberately or fake falling asleep during briefings from the army to show how much he thought of them. But I never heard of this chap. Very much a political creature. Great stuff as always. Definitely. This was very much a political creature, and yes. Interesting. Flag, naval flag officers. And it, as always, it's in a nice alphabetical order. I'm just going to read out from this book the personality facts. Tall, very religious, a very clever man, shrewd, charming, a yes man. Always followed the advice of Prince Hersh Fushimi in important decisions. Excessive cooperation with General Tojo. Basically, depending on who was the most powerful person in the room, he followed them. When Fushimi was in the room, followed him. When Tojo was in the room, he followed him. Not sure how a yes person gets that high in the Navy. This is one reason. This gives you a sort of lower opinion of the Japanese Navy, but he got up there. Right then. This is rapid going through because there have been less comments about these ones. Koshiro Oikawa. Now, he's more interesting in some extent. Awesome. This one comes off as one of the few sensible people who could see the reality of Japan's situation, amidst a room full of nationalists and people acting far outside their qualifications, running a fast train to ruin. True. Nick Borden, the fluffy research assistant is taking over. As I said, been his plan all along. He watched the Star Wars prequels too often. He's watched many of them. Seriously, the dog is a bigger Star Trek fan than I am. If I do not put the new episodes of Picard, which he knows which day of the week when it comes out somehow. I don't know how. He also knows that when the Lower Decks comes out, he knows that's on a Friday. And he always wants to come down to my office. And if I don't put it on after bilge pumps, he will literally jump up in my lap non-stop. And if I put it on screen on my right. Normally while I'm working on the left screen. He will sit and watch it the whole time. That dog is a science fiction nut. George Crab. He got to try and fix an impossible situation that he knew was a bad idea from the start. Pretty much. The fact that he actually did as well as he did, the fact that he even accepted a role, makes me respect him. Shane Patrick, there is no emphasis on individual Japanese syllables. If you say it flat, it sounds like Nipponese. Edit. The line over the last letter notes the O should be drawn out to 2 syllables. So, therefore, it should be Koshiro Oikawa. We'll see if I can get it right. Here he is. Thank you. Some point I'm going to sit down with a friend when we can do these face-to-face more easily to try at least improve my name pronunciation. It's not easy. Good luck with the languages. Thank you. As I said before, because of my type of dyslexia, and I explained this in the previous video, I couldn't do language and stopped 13, which means everything since has been friends, travel, and self-taught, which possibly is why I've got some things really weirdly. Siwinish, regarding gaining more subscribers, perhaps more collaborations with other channels? Thank you, I will do. And Steve, I will say, I do normally like your comments. I know there was an earlier comment I have taken a small amount of umbrage to, but the comments are normally quite well through. Sweeping statements are what usually annoy me in history. They are a personal bête noire because, honestly, I can pick them apart normally quite so easily because of the various context. Everything is never as simple as we like to put it out to be. Even I sometimes listen to myself, referring to an earlier comment, and hear a statement I make and go, right then, I'm going to clarify that one because that was a very big sweeping statement. Great series. Are you thinking of doing something like this for the Allies? Yes. As a Canadian, I have no knowledge of the Canadian officers who ran our Navy during the war. Well, let me answer that first question. The officer most responsible for the Canadian Navy in World War II is a guy called Vice Admiral P.W. Nels, who goes on to become a full admiral. He is otherwise known as Percy Walker Nels. And he is absolutely an amazing character who is so deserves a video about him. He serves on HMS Dreadnought in 1911. He serves on HMS Suffolk in 1914. He has a tremendously huge amount of experience. He serves in the Royal Navy pretty much till 1931, reverting to the rank of commander in 1931 when he does that because he's been promoted as acting captain and of HMS Dragon when she was on her cruise after the captain of her died so unexpectedly. That's a D-class cruiser. As such, because of his seniority, Commodore Walter Hose, the then predecessor in charge of the Canadian Navy, recommends him to be his successor. And therefore, he is appointed to first command HMCS Sangway and in charge of the Canadian destroyer flotilla. And after 1933, he's given time at the Imperial Defense College. He's put in charge of Stadacoa, and he's promoted to full captain in pretty much in 1933. First ever Canadian in RNCN history to be affirmed in that rank. He's made acting Chief of Staff of Navy in December 1933. In 1934, he's confirmed a position, promoted to Commodore. Rear Admiral in 1938. And he serves all the way through. until 1944. He's removed from post because he's having conflicts with Angus Lewis MacDonald, who's the Minister of National Defence for Naval Service, but doesn't because he's so publicly well known and so publicly popular. He is not publicly dismissed from duty. He's transferred to Great Britain and given the post of Senior Canadian Flag Officer Overseas, which is an admin role. And upon his retirement, he's promoted to full admiral. But the person you're looking for is Percy Walker-Nels. And I hope, Blaine, that helps you. There will be a video about him at some point. And I am going to look up the book you recommended. I have looked it up, I think. I haven't been able to find a copy, but I have looked up. Dr. C, would you also consider Vichy French animals as well? As I said, it isn't bad enough that certain French Twitter are holding me single-handedly responsible for the recent Australian submarine decision. They still are. You want me to be crushed by what the World War II issues as well? I'm going to do a separate series on the French animals. They're varied enough and random enough. Guido, the IJN seem to have a lot of admirals. They do. They did. They had a lot of admirals. Jack Ray, thanks for the video. Thank you. Whiskey Tiangasira, the love sponge in your lap is nearly as cool as mine. Yes, that was from the poodle. Hugh Fisher, in attempt to Dr. Clarke talking from sunrise to sunset on Dreadnought Day, I have a topic suggestion: best battlecruiser design of World War II. I'm not going to get into this here, but there is going to be a lot of videos on Dreadnought Day. A lot of live videos. I'm planning on doing probably 3. The Shrike 616, really again, fantastic. Thank you. Serving the IJA armed forces does sound like a dangerous proposition. With enemies are both above and below your own ranks. It is quite interesting. Oh, definitely complicated. Right. So, it's going to be 37:30 by the time we get to the next one, which is P11, which is Soemu Toyoda. Right. George Crab, I enjoyed the information on the anti-war Japanese faction. There was quite a strong one. So, very interesting segment. Potsdam did mention protecting and retaining the emperor did not mention protecting and retaining the emperor's figurehead. Not much of a demotion, really, since the military had the factions to gain control. So I wonder if Koshiro Toyoda's reluctance was about that. Soemu Toyoda? Maybe. Also, interesting is his complaints about the army refusing to curtail their activities in the later war period in China. Japan had a highly successful campaign in central and southern China, Southeast Asia and Burma in 1944 that gained hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory. Operation Ichigo. It essentially connected all the dots along the coast and went far inland as well. This greatest achievement of the war for the army happened at a time when the Navy was already clearly defeated. One can imagine the jealousy there. But when one looks at it objectively, those army resources could be described as being well spent, although too late to matter much except to the post-war China Civil War, which favoured the communists because of the way in their very heavy nationalist losses in Ichigo. While in contrast, the resources squandered in the Pacific Islands were not well spent in the end. Not only the well-known island losses, but the tens of thousands of Japanese troops bypassed Iceland. The problem with the army's success in Ichigo was that they did not then redeploy to Manchuria in time to stop or at least slow the Soviet attack. The real reason the Soviets found the Japanese forces to be a shell of an army, which was at least partially a failure of the diplomatic intelligence services, but totally missing it. If Toyoda was bitching about that, he should have looked to his own intelligence agency first. Rival. The issue with that is the army's gains in Ichigo do nothing to help Japan at that point. Japan is an island. Without a navy, any gains the army made were useless. This does seem to be something the Imperial Japanese Army just seems unwilling to accept at any point. They could win every battle, and it does not matter if the Navy loses. Without the Navy, the army can be cut off from its supplies. The resources it's taken can't be shipped home. Spending the resources taking more land was not worth it post-Midway. Yes, they were never going to win anyway, but the army should have consolidated and dug in and allowed the resources to go to replacing naval losses. See which, the problem with that is they were never going to be any significant naval replacements. Even if they had managed to build a few more escorts, the only thing that they could be built in the time remaining, the subs would sink those too. And for another year and a half or so after Midway, they could have greatly benefited from a fully controlled Chinese southern coast, with all the occupied ports connected. French in China, Burma, so Ichigo 2 years earlier would have been very much worth it for them. 2 years earlier, Steve. Not though when it happened. The resources could have been sent all along the coast in sampans, small ships, the way it did in late 1940-45, and at that time, the US subs or aircraft would not have been able to interdict much. Arrivons. Maybe so, but again, that would not. But what would the cost and resources do that 2 years earlier to do that 2 years earlier have been? What would have been traded off to do it? You might well do it and get an increase in resources coming in, but as you point out, the army can't do much with them, and A, can't do much, and B, if you have to pull back or not to defend against the US somewhere else, they might get closer sooner. Ultimately, the point I'd make is this. Once you decide on the Navy strategy to go for the islands on the southern strategy, the southern resource area, you have to commit to it. That means you have to commit to it. If the army doesn't commit to it, then the Navy's never going to succeed in it. So that's on them. And this is part of Japan's issues. You've got the army going off going, yes, we've got glory. Navy, hold the line. If they're not supporting it, they can't. And the army does have its own navy. They are both building LSTs. They're both building all sorts of things. And the navy is just as guilty of this as the army. But honestly, they needed to pull together if they wanted to try and hold off America as much as possible. And you think how bad those island campaigns were. Imagine if those islands had more troops on them. Imagine if those resources which go to Ichigo and the other operations had been put into fortifying those islands. Yes, the Americans bypass islands, but they can't bypass all of them. They bypass a lot of them, but they can't bypass all of them. And if they are the ones they have to fight on have a lot more troops on, then they're in trouble. Because it's going to cost them that much more to take them. And that's going to wear down their own amphibious forces faster, and they're going to have to regenerate those. And that's what you have to think about. You are fighting an attrition war. Every time you make the enemy take longer between a fight, that gives you more time to reinforce other positions. So everything you can take out in any individual fight is important. Andrew Cox, you know that the two sides aren't speaking the same language when one side starts pulling out references to events over 70 years ago. Dan Freeman, did you mention Utah? I missed the detail, but I have an aunt and uncle who live in Salt Lake City, and a bonus, I can so should understand the need for data. Yes, all his stuff is stored in Utah. A lot of the Japanese transcripts of the Japanese interviews has ended up in Utah. Doug M. France hasn't been an ally of the US since Lafayette. Merely partners of convenience. I presume that's to do with the submarine issues. But you know, they're all fun. So we're going to do a part 4. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed these 3 parts, and there are 3 more to come. Take care.